By your local state and
Traditionally, radio is where people have turned for information and entertainment. Over the years, technology has put radio in our homes, vehicles, and on our person. During the mid-90s, the Federal Communications Commission, along with the United States Congress, approved the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which allowed ownership of multiple media outlets by a single entity.
Well, it really didn't take a long time for, it was called the era of the media merger, where companies were buying up other stations. So that happened a lot because, again, without going into specific detail, Telecommunications Act allowed owners to pretty much buy whatever they wanted. If you owned a newspaper, you could buy radio. If you owned television, you could buy radio and newspaper. And you really couldn't do that before, and basically kind of open up the market to however much money you had. For the most part, you could buy as many radio, television, newspaper stations as you could afford.
The initial response to it, as somebody who was on the air and doing it, we thought, well, this could be a good thing. What we started to see is companies then come in who didn't necessarily do radio become the buy-in because it became a business more so than an art form. And that was the initial change that I saw going in 1996, being in radio at the time.
The effects that I saw were a lot of radio stations went up for sale. People who had owned stations for some time and decided it was time to get out of the business. Maybe they were older and didn't have anybody, heirs who might take it over, decided it was time to sell stations. And there were plenty of buyers out there who wanted to build empires. And that's what the effect has been since 1996.
After the initial passing of the Telecommunications Act, massive conglomerates bought up station after station and now had a direct effect on multimedia outlets nationwide.
Well, from an industry-wide perspective, it was still a situation where there was a lot of station swapping still going on. Everybody knows about Time Warner. At one point, Time Warner owned a lot of different companies, radio, television, newspapers. So there was a lot, the wheels were spinning, but in the fact that there was so much movement going on.
One of the things was there was this idea that radio, like I said, had become a business. So now there were, for lack of a better phrase, people who were business people now doing radio, not radio people doing business. And there is a difference. And what you found is that those people who didn't saw it as a business opportunity. They began to take over and they began to make business decisions rather than radio decisions. So what you began to see is the cutback in staff, because they began to take technology, which I will say is a good thing if used the correct way. They began to take technology and use it to replace people.
As the consolidation of ownership continued, profit became the main motivator in the industry. Not only were playlists homogenized to create a more standard listening experience, but having multiple facets of the industry under one roof saw the potential to severely limit artist exposure.
Take the 80s, for example. You could turn on a radio station in the 80s and you would hear everything from Kool and the Gang to the Whispers to U2 to Aerosmith, all on the same station. It began to get very segmented and the playlist began to shrink. So then 10, 15 years later, like in the 90s, what you found, in the 2000s especially, you found 40 songs that you could only play, and there wasn't that kind of variety.
Knowing of one large radio station company that also is a concert promoter, and if an artist was coming into that market and that concert was not being promoted by that company, that radio station, or with the appropriate format, did not play the records of that artist at that time.
When you're working for a station manager who's a radio person, what you'll find is, in many cases during this time, they would stick up for the radio side of things. they would then say, no, we're going to keep our playlists a little farther open. What you found with the business people is that it was a business. So their job was to keep their job. And what they end up doing is they'll say, okay, we can't play, for example, the Dixie Chicks because of what they said about George Bush. We can't play that because we don't want the parent corporation to come down on us, so we'll just eliminate them.
Some of the companies that grew up and have hundreds of radio stations now, as opposed to when there was a limit of 12 AM, 12 FM, and 12 TV, they continue to acquire stations, and they'll jettison markets that aren't working for them, which kind of leaves a void. Sometimes stations have been allowed to go off the air because they couldn't find a buyer.
The trends continued after the first decade, without a doubt. But one of the things that I talked about this earlier, technology came into play. Now, the idea of what they call voice tracking, and I don't know if you've heard of that, but voice tracking is basically is I'm in, let's say, Los Angeles. I can now put my voice over a track in Delaware. Okay, and what then can end up happening is I can then eliminate the person who's doing that show, because I don't necessarily need that person, because this person can do 20 or 30 different stations across the country doing the same thing. All you have to do is send him the playlist, and then he'll say that was, this is, da 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 da, boom 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 boom, and you can send it across the internet. And boom, it's there at the station.
The net effect of that has not been good for the overall audience. Radio and television stations are licensed in the public interest. And in many cases, these large companies are acting more in their own interest than the public interest.
You might be enjoying your hometown station where you couldn't listen to. Now with social media, you can listen to a station in California, you can listen to a station in Texas. If it's handled properly and done well, you can get audiences from a larger region.
But the other trend is now that there's competition. There's satellite radio, there's internet radio, and that's taking a lot of listeners away.
And the internet is a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong. I think it's a great thing. I wouldn't have been able to start HSRN had it not been for the internet. So I'm starting from scratch. And the way that we got our name out there and were able to get on Sirius XM and regular and terrestrial affiliates was that we started on the internet. We created a buzz on the internet. Now, radio stations are hurting because they don't know where this is going to lead. They don't know that with all the downloading and all that kind of stuff that, you know, the radio has kind of gotten hurt because people are now advertising on the internet and the whole deal.
From 1996 to now, one thing remains evident. Mass media is big business. While the industry has grown to new heights, some feel the Telecommunications Act has marginalized many of its listeners in the name of profit. Clear Channel and several of its affiliates were contacted to take part in this documentary, but no response was given.
The ultimate answer to the question of the effects of the Telecommunications Act is still being written. While ownership consolidation has caused the industry to rise to new heights, it's also helped spark a digital revolution, ultimately putting the fate back in the hands of the listeners.